The first pine cone showed up the winter she thought she wouldn't make it through the holidays. By the time she blew out the last candle and turned to go inside, there it was on the doormat, perfect, unbroken, dusted with snow. She looked up, and at the far edge of the yard, between the pines and the moonlit drift, a bear stood watching her, still and calm, as if waiting for her to understand. The snow had been falling since early afternoon, soft and steady, as if the sky had decided to tuck the little mountain town beneath a white quilt for the night. Aisha stood at her kitchen window, a mug of tea warming her hands, watching the drifts creep up the wooden porch steps. She had finished hanging the small string of lights along the railing earlier, their faint glow now softened by the snow that had gathered on them. Christmas Eve had always been a quiet night for her. Years ago, when her parents were still alive, the evening had been filled with the smell of cinnamon, the murmur of carols, and the slow, steady warmth of a wood stove. But now, the cabin was silent except for the occasional pop from the fire and the hush of the snow outside. She moved to the front door, opened it just enough to step out onto the porch, and set the old lantern on the small table beside the door. Its warm light spread across the snow-dusted boards, casting long, soft shadows. She'd begun this lantern ritual her first winter alone, more for herself than anyone else. Just a small act to keep the night from feeling empty. It was close to midnight when she decided to bring the lantern in. The tea was long gone, and her toes were beginning to ache from the cold seeping through her thick socks. She reached for the handle of the lantern and then stopped. There, on the doormat, was a pine cone. Not just any pine cone, perfect, unbroken, symmetrical, the kind you might see in a photograph. Snow clung to its edges like delicate frosting. For a moment, she simply stared at it, puzzled. She hadn't seen a pine cone all winter, the storms had been too fierce, stripping the trees bare. And yet here it was, resting squarely in the center of the mat as though someone, or something, had placed it there on purpose. She bent down to pick it up, brushing the snow gently from its scales. That's when movement caught her eye. At the far edge of the yard, where the pines stood tall and dark against the moonlit snow, a large shape shifted. Slowly, deliberately, a bear stepped forward into the pale light. Its fur was thick and dusted white, each breath visible in the cold air. It didn't move toward her. It didn't run. It simply stood there, calm and unthreatening, its dark eyes fixed on her. Aisha's breath caught. She had seen bears before, of course, living in the mountains made that inevitable, but never like this. Never so close, never so still, never without fear on either side. They watched each other for what felt like a long time. The bear's head tilted slightly, almost as if it were studying her the way she was studying it. The pine cone felt heavier in her hand. Then, without a sound, the bear turned and walked back toward the trees. Its massive frame slipped between the trunks and vanished into the shadows, leaving only the faint trace of pawprints in the snow. Aisha stood there for a few moments longer, her pulse still quick from the encounter. She looked down at the pine cone in her hand. It was ridiculous to think it had brought it to her, and yet, the thought rooted itself in her mind and refused to let go. Inside, she set the pine cone on the mantel above the stove, where the firelight caught the tiny crystals of snow still clinging to it. She told herself it was just a strange coincidence, a story to tell a neighbor one day. But deep down, something in her felt different. The porch didn't seem quite as empty anymore. Aisha tried to convince herself that the pinecone had been a one-off, some odd trick of wind and snow, an accident that only looked like intention. But the thought didn't hold through the spring, not through the soft months when the trail above town opened and she hiked with her sketchbook, nor through autumn when the first cold brushed the larches to gold. Every time she swept the porch she found herself glancing at the spot by the doormat, feeling half foolish and half expectant, as if she'd been given a riddle and told to wait a year for the answer. December drew its quiet circle again. The school where she taught closed for the holidays, and her students' last charcoal studies, hands, feathers, the curve of a pine cone, still dried on the racks. On Christmas Eve she cooked a simple meal, washed the single plate, and put on her father's old wool coat. Snow had started early, a fine sift like flour across the steps. She lifted the lantern from its hook, lit the wick, and set it on the small table outside as she had done the year before. The habit felt less like a talisman now, more like an invitation. She waited longer this time. Midnight slipped toward the hour beyond it, the one that feels very far from other people. The wind lifted and lowered, the trees giving a slow breath. When her hands went numb through the gloves, she reached for the lantern's handle. Then the board spoke, one low creak, a second, a pause. Aisha stilled. The shape at the yard's edge gathered itself from shadow, and the bear stepped into the spill of lantern light. Not a lunge, not even a straight line, just that measured, deliberate walk she remembered, shoulders rolling under a thick winter coat, head level, eyes quiet. Its breath rose in soft ropes. She noticed the fur around the muzzle was rimed with frost, the way the snow rested on its back in neat ovals that didn't melt right away. It stopped at the bottom step and waited. The distance was the same as last year, close enough that she could see the whisker pads rise and fall with each breath, far enough that neither of them needed to prove anything. Then the bear did something that folded the world smaller. It turned its head, lowered its muzzle to the snow by the porch post, and picked up a pine cone she hadn't seen there, as if it had set it down just out of sight on its way in. The pinecone sat between its teeth, not clamped but held, a careful grip. The bear climbed a single step and extended its head toward the mat, opened its jaw, and placed the cone in the center. Not dropped. Placed. Aisha saw the brief, exacting motion of tongue and teeth, the way it eased back so the cone wouldn't tumble. Her throat tightened. She didn't move, though her whole body wanted to. The bear held still a few breaths longer, steam clouding around the lantern's glow, then shifted. It turned as deliberately as it had come, descended the step, and padded back across the yard, paws vanishing into their own prints. At the tree-line it paused, dark against the snow, and for a heartbeat she imagined, no, felt, that it looked back. Then the trees received it and it was gone. When she finally knelt, her knees found the cold through the wood. The pinecone was perfect again, symmetrical like a small cathedral. She brushed off the lace of snow, lifted it, and found another cone resting just to the side of the mat, as if the first had brought a friend. She hadn't noticed it in the bear's careful choreography. To this year. Inside, she dried them and set them on the mantel beside the first, angling them so the lantern light from the porch, seeping through the window, picked out their edges. She took her sketchbook from the shelf and, hands still shaking, drew what she remembered, the posture, the line where shoulder becomes back, the way the paw leaves a crisp star in fresh powder. She wrote the date under the drawing and, beneath that, a single sentence, placed them, didn't drop them. In the morning she walked the yard, measuring the prints with a ruler like a field biologist who'd misplaced her lab. 6 inches across for the front, longer for the rear. She followed them to the edge of the pines where the wind erased the rest. She didn't go farther. It wasn't a trail to be pressed, only acknowledged. That week, she drove into town for groceries and stopped by the ranger station. It was a small, wood-smelling room with laminated trail maps and a rack of bear-safe trash lids. The ranger on duty, gray flannel, kind eyes, listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once. Bears are curious. They remember. And some individuals form routes. Rituals, even. It's not affection the way we mean it, but it's not nothing. He tapped a list on the counter: no feeding, no approaching, no talking to it like a pet, keep lights steady, keep distance. You're doing the right thing, he said. Let it be what it is. On the way home, she bought a small tin lantern with a better wind guard. That evening she checked the hinges on the porch gate, tightened the loose board that had squeaked since fall. The practicalities were easy, the part that lived under her ribs was not. She found herself thinking about her mother setting out winter oranges in a bowl every December, simple offerings to a season that asked you to step carefully. School resumed. A student asked if pinecones ever mean anything, and Aisha smiled in a way the girl couldn't parse, then showed the class how to draw overlapping scales with graphite, how each one fits into the next if you look closely enough. At home that night, she labeled the mantelpieces with tiny paper tags, Year 1, Year 2, and felt both silly and steadied by the neatness of it. When Christmas approached again, she didn't make a ceremony bigger than the last. She swept the steps. She tested the wick. She set the lantern where the light fell evenly across the mat. She did not look over her shoulder when the boards finally creaked, because she already knew the sound. And when the bear appeared, quiet, deliberate, the snow finding its back, she did the same thing she had done the year before, nothing at all. She held still and watched, and let the moment be precise. The bear carried 3 pinecones that third winter, or perhaps one at a time, returned from the edge of dark to place them, triangular, neat. She noticed how carefully it avoided the threshold, how it oriented them with larger scales outward, smaller inward, the pattern tighter than hers would have been had she done it herself. When it left, the arrangement remained like a small, wordless diagram between them: you are there, I am here, and this is the line we keep. Aisha went inside and set the new cones on the mantel with the others, shifting the first 2 an inch to make room. She stood back, the fire murmuring, the glass flashing the lantern's outside glow, and realized the mantel had become its own quiet calendar. 3 winters, 3 gifts. Not a superstition. Not proof of anything beyond itself. But a thread, unmistakable as the track of paws in new snow. She made tea and sat on the floor by the stove, palms around the mug, the heat moving into her fingers. On the page she wrote a different sentence: not for science, not for anyone else to read, it knows the way to my door, and I know the way to leave the door open without stepping through. Outside, the lantern burned. Inside, the cones held their shape. She let the house settle into the long, faithful silence of cold, and for the first time in years the holiday felt less like something to endure and more like something to mark. Not louder. Just truer. By the 4th year, the pinecones on her mantel had begun to change the way Aisha looked at time. It wasn't just about dates on a calendar anymore. Winters weren't measured by snowfall or holiday cards, but by how many perfect pinecones sat in a row above the stove, each carrying the weight of a Christmas Eve. That year, December came colder and darker than the last. The wind from the ridgeline rattled the porch lights most nights, and even the local deer had retreated deeper into the forest. Town felt quieter. School let out early for the holidays, and she spent the last week before Christmas tucked into the cabin, painting by the window and sketching pine boughs while the snow built up outside. On Christmas Eve, the air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. She wrapped herself in her heaviest coat and wound a thick scarf around her neck before stepping out to light the lantern. The wick caught on the first strike, and the glow spilled across the porch like honey pooling at the center of the doormat. She left the door open just a crack, letting the warm air from inside meet the night, and waited. The world beyond the yard was silver and still, the snow reflecting the nearly full moon. It didn't take long this time. The first sign was the hush that fell over the trees, a quiet that felt different from the ordinary stillness of winter. Then came the faint crunch of snow under heavy weight, deliberate and unhurried. She knew the sound so well now that her body relaxed into it before her eyes even found him. The bear emerged from the pines like a shadow pulling itself into form. His coat was thick and dark, dusted with snow. The scar above his right eye caught the moonlight for an instant before he dipped his head. This time, she saw it clearly, he was carrying something. One pinecone in his mouth, perfectly intact. He reached the porch steps and paused, looking up at her with the same unblinking calm he always had. Then, in a series of movements so deliberate they almost looked rehearsed, he placed the pinecone on the mat. But he didn't turn away immediately. Instead, he stepped down into the snow again, and for the first time, she saw him circle to the side of the porch, toward the edge where the pine boughs hung low over the fence. He disappeared into the shadow for only a moment before returning, this time carrying another pinecone. He placed it beside the first, the spacing neat and deliberate. She felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just a drop and go. This was careful placement, like an arrangement. She'd seen him be precise before, but this was different, it had intention. When he returned with a third pinecone, arranging it so the three formed a small, perfect triangle, she knew. This wasn't accident or random instinct. This was a message in a language without words, a conversation 4 winters in the making. The bear stood still for a few moments after the third pinecone was set. Snow drifted from the overhang of the porch roof, scattering in the lantern light. His breath came in slow clouds, and his eyes stayed on hers, not demanding, not asking, just holding the space between them. Then, as always, he turned toward the tree line. His prints in the snow were deeper this year, heavier, but they traced the same patient path back into the woods. When she bent to pick up the pinecones, the snow was cold against her fingertips. She brushed each one off and held it for a moment before carrying them inside. The fire in the stove glowed low, but the light from the lantern outside spilled through the window, catching the curve of each scale. She set the new pinecones beside the others, aligning them carefully. The row was beginning to feel less like decoration and more like a chaptered story, each cone a page. That night, as she sat sketching by the stove, she caught herself drawing the bear, not from memory alone, but with the details she'd learned to see over the years, the set of his shoulders, the precise curve of his muzzle, the way his fur caught snow like a net. And she realized that even though they had never touched, never crossed that silent boundary, his presence had filled her winters with something she didn't know she'd been missing. By the 5th winter, the ritual had become more than something Aisha observed, it was something she prepared for. The week before Christmas Eve, she swept the porch twice a day, even when the snow covered it again within hours. She oiled the hinges on the door so it would open without a sound, replaced the wick in the lantern so the flame would burn steady. And this year, she decided she wouldn't just watch from the doorway. Christmas Eve came crisp and clear, the moon rising early, turning the snow into a sheet of silver glass. She bundled herself in her thickest coat, pulled on her knit hat, and stepped outside before the night deepened too much. The lantern's light glowed warm on the table by the door, its flame steady in the still air. She stood at the far end of the porch, leaning against the railing. From here, she could see the open yard clearly, the dark shape of the pines at the forest edge, and the clean stretch of snow between. Her breath clouded in the cold as she listened. At first, there was nothing but the faint hum of winter silence. Then, as if the forest itself had taken a breath, she heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of snow under heavy weight. The bear emerged from the trees with the same unhurried pace she had come to know. His coat was deep brown, dusted with snowflakes that sparkled under the moonlight. The scar above his right eye caught the light as he moved, and his eyes were fixed forward, not on the ground, but on her. This year, she noticed something different. He wasn't carrying a pinecone in his mouth. Instead, as he approached the porch steps, he set down a pinecone from somewhere just out of sight, then returned to the tree-lean. She waited, leaning on the railing, as he reappeared a minute later with a second pinecone. He placed it beside the first with the same care she'd seen before, nose low, jaw easing open, the cone resting in place without rolling. When he returned with the third, she realized he was arranging them in the same triangle pattern as last year. But this time, after placing the final pinecone, he lifted his head and looked directly at her across the short space between them. They stayed like that for a long moment, two still figures, lantern light between them, the cold air heavy with quiet understanding. Slowly, without breaking eye contact, she crouched down, resting her gloved hands on her knees. She didn't reach for the pinecones, she knew better than to close the space. But the gesture seemed to shift something in the air. The bear blinked once, then gave the smallest tilt of his head. Aisha's breath caught, not from fear, but from the strange, grounding calm that came with his presence. After another quiet pause, he stepped back from the mat, turned toward the yard, and retraced his path into the forest. She watched until the dark swallowed him, his prints crisp in the moonlit snow. When she finally picked up the pinecones, the cold from them seeped through her gloves. Inside, she set them on the mantel with the others, lining them in a row that now curved slightly to make room. The firelight caught the snow still clinging in the cracks, tiny beads melting into the warm air. That night, she couldn't sleep right away. She sat at her work table instead, sketching the bear from memory, but this time she drew the porch too, the lantern, the railing, the pattern of pinecones, and herself standing there, part of the same winter picture. It struck her that in all these years, they had never moved closer than the steps, never broken that invisible line. And yet, somehow, they'd managed to meet in the same place every year, not in distance, but in trust. The sixth winter came in with teeth. By the middle of December, the storms were rolling in one after another, burying the town in snow so deep the plows could barely keep the roads open. Aisha's cabin, tucked against the slope, felt more remote than ever. Nights were so quiet she could hear the wind dragging across the roof and the deep groan of trees bending under ice. By Christmas Eve, another blizzard had swept through. The wind rattled the shutters and drove snow sideways into the porch, piling it knee-high against the railing. She'd cleared it twice already that day, but within an hour the drifts returned. The lantern sat cold and empty on the table by the door, and she caught herself staring at it, thinking it would be foolish to light it tonight. The ritual had never been broken, but this weather. It wasn't just dangerous for her. The bear would have to cross half the valley in this storm. It wasn't possible. Even so, as darkness fell, she lit the lantern. The flame flickered in the gusts, but the glass held. Snow swirled around it in frantic spirals. She stood in the doorway a moment, looking at the white chaos beyond, then closed the door against the wind. Hours passed. The wind didn't let up. She told herself she'd blow out the lantern soon and go to bed. But something kept her from doing it. It was nearly midnight when she heard it, a low, slow creak of the porch boards under weight. At first, she thought it might be the wind tugging the frame, but then came the second creak. And the third. She opened the door, the wind slapping cold against her face. Snowflakes stung her cheeks, but through the blur of white, a shape took form. The bear. Snow clung to his fur in thick clumps, icicles hanging from the longer guard hairs along his belly. He moved slower than usual, pushing through the drifts until he reached the bottom of the steps. In his mouth was a pinecone. Even through the howl of the wind, she could hear the soft thump as he set it on the mat. Then he stepped back, head low against the gusts, and turned toward the yard. The snow was so deep it swallowed his legs to the knees. Aisha's breath fogged the air as she watched him disappear into the storm. His prints were already filling in with fresh snow before she bent to pick up the pinecone. It was smaller than most, the edges worn, but intact. She brushed off the snow and carried it inside, her hands trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. She set it on the mantel between the others. The fire popped in the stove, and the glow lit the row of pinecones like a line of small, dark sentinels. That night, lying in bed, she realized something had shifted. The ritual had survived its first true test, not because it was easy or because the weather allowed it, but because, against all reason, he had come anyway. By the seventh winter, the mantel above Aisha's stove had begun to resemble a small museum. Each pinecone had its own year written on a paper tag, tied neatly with twine around the base. Some were still perfect and symmetrical, others bore the wear of travel, their edges chipped or darkened. She had stopped trying to explain the ritual to anyone else. This was not a story that needed an audience, it was something she and the bear carried between them. That Christmas Eve was calm compared to the last. Snow fell lightly, drifting in small spirals under the glow of the porch lantern. The cold was sharp but not cruel, and the forest beyond the yard was still enough that she could hear the faint creak of tree trunks shifting under the frost. She stood outside this time, wrapped in her thickest coat, waiting with both hands around a mug of tea. The steam rose in slow ribbons, vanishing into the night. The bear arrived earlier than usual, his approach marked by the soft crunch of snow and the familiar bulk emerging from the tree lean. She smiled before she even saw the scar above his right eye. As he came closer, she noticed something odd. His mouth was full, but the shape was wrong for a pinecone. It looked larger, darker, irregular. He reached the porch steps, lowered his head, and placed it gently on the mat. It wasn't a pinecone. Aisha crouched to look closer. It was a large piece of birch bark, curled into a neat tube, its surface flecked with frost. Inside, nestled in the curl of the bark, was a single pinecone, smaller than most, but intact. The bear stepped back after placing it, his eyes never leaving her. She didn't reach out immediately. Instead, she studied him in the lantern light, the way the snow clung to his fur, the way his breath clouded between them. Finally, she knelt and picked up the bark, careful not to spill the pinecone from its hollow. The bark was cold and surprisingly smooth against her gloves. She looked up again, but he had already turned toward the yard. This time, he didn't go straight to the trees. He paused halfway, his head lifting as if to catch a scent on the air. Then, without looking back, he disappeared into the forest. Inside, she set the bark and pine cone together on the mantel, moving the older ones slightly to make room. The birch bark stood out against the dark shapes beside it, pale and curling like the edge of a parchment scroll. She sat in her chair for a long time after, staring at it in the firelight. Maybe it was just something he'd found. Maybe it meant nothing at all. But she couldn't help feeling that the addition was deliberate, that after years of sameness, he had decided to change the pattern, to add a new piece to their unspoken exchange. Later, she drew it exactly as she'd found it, the pale curl of bark, the pinecone nestled inside, the faint scatter of frost still clinging to its edges. Underneath, she wrote in small, careful letters, "First gift not of pine." Something has shifted. The 8th winter began with heavy snow in early November, burying the mountain paths and silencing the forest under a thick white blanket. By Christmas Eve, the snowpack was waist-deep in some places, but the sky was clear, the moon casting a silver sheen over the untouched drifts. Aisha had started her preparations earlier that afternoon. She swept the porch, lit the lantern before dusk, and placed a small basket of pine boughs by the door, not as an offering, but as a way of making the porch feel more like a place to linger. She didn't know why she'd done it, but something about the way the bear had brought the birch bark last year made her think he might notice. The night was still when she stepped outside, the cold biting at her cheeks. She leaned against the railing, eyes on the dark line of the trees. Her breath rose in slow clouds, disappearing into the starlit air. The sound came earlier than she expected, the soft crunch of snow under a deliberate, heavy gate. The bear appeared at the forest's edge, moving with the steady patience she knew so well. The scar above his right eye caught the moonlight for an instant before he dipped his head. This time, his mouth held a pinecone again, large, perfect, dusted with frost. He stepped onto the porch without hesitation, the boards creaking softly under his weight. Instead of placing the pinecone quickly and retreating, he moved toward the center of the porch, setting it directly on the mat before lifting his head toward her. They were close now, so close she could hear the faint huff of his breathing, see the small flecks of ice caught in the fur along his muzzle. She didn't move. Minutes passed. The bear's gaze shifted briefly toward the basket of pine boughs, his nose twitching, before returning to her. The space between them felt fragile, like a thread that could hold or snap at any moment. Slowly, Aisha lowered herself to sit cross-legged on the porch boards, her back against the railing. She didn't lean forward, didn't reach out, just sat there, her hands resting loosely in her lap. The bear stayed. He turned slightly, sitting on his haunches near the edge of the porch, his head swiveling to watch the forest as if on guard. Every so often, his gaze would return to her, calm and steady. It was impossible to measure time in those moments. The cold bit at her legs, but she didn't care. The quiet felt complete, the world reduced to the warm glow of the lantern, the slow rhythm of 2 breaths in the winter air, and the pinecone between them. Finally, the bear shifted to stand. He stepped off the porch, his massive paws sinking into the snow, and began the slow walk back toward the trees. She didn't follow with her eyes this time, she kept them on the pinecone until the crunch of snow faded completely. Inside, she placed the new pinecone on the mantel beside the birch bark from the year before. She didn't tag it that night. Somehow, she felt this one didn't need a label. The 9th winter arrived without warning. November had been mild, but the snow came in one sharp storm at the start of December, coating the forest in white. The days after were strangely calm, the kind of stillness that made sound carry farther than usual. Even from her porch, Aisha could hear the far-off groan of trees shifting on the ridge. She had been painting in the studio when she realized the light outside had shifted. The sun had only just dropped behind the mountains, and already the moon was up, a pale disk hanging low in the east. Christmas Eve wasn't supposed to be for another few hours, at least by their usual pattern. But as she stepped onto the porch to check the lantern's wick, she froze. He was already there. The bear stood at the far edge of the yard, not emerging from the forest but waiting, still and solid against the white. His breath puffed in slow clouds, and the scar above his right eye was a thin, pale line in the moonlight. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he began to walk, steady, deliberate, each step sinking deep into the snow. In his mouth was a pinecone, but unlike the others, this one was pale, its scales lighter than any she had seen. He reached the bottom step and paused. Instead of placing the pinecone right away, he stood there, looking at her, the lantern's light flickering between them. Aisha stepped forward, the porch boards creaking under her boots. She kept her pace slow, stopping at the top step. The air between them felt charged, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Finally, he lifted his head slightly and stepped forward, placing the pinecone not on the mat, but on the bottom step, closer to her than ever before. The pale scales glinted in the light, a dusting of snow melting into tiny beads of water. She didn't reach for it. She only crouched, lowering herself so her eyes were level with his. For the first time, she thought she saw something like recognition, not the wild, wary look of an animal assessing danger, but the calm acceptance of one meeting an old friend. The bear stayed there for several minutes, the space between them reduced to a single step and the pale pinecone. She could hear the quiet huff of his breathing, the faint creak of ice in the trees, and nothing else. Then, without warning, he turned, not toward the forest, but along the edge of the yard, following a line of tracks that disappeared into the darker trees beyond. She watched until he was gone, the pale pinecone sitting alone on the step. Inside, she placed it in the center of the mantle, separate from the others. Something about it felt different, as if it belonged to a new category in their shared history. She didn't know why he had come early, or why the pinecone was unlike any before, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this year, something more was coming. The night after the early visit, Aisha barely slept. The pale pinecone sat alone on the mantel, and every time she glanced at it, she felt a strange, weighty anticipation. The bear had never come twice in a single year. Never broken the rhythm. But something in her gut told her the story of this winter wasn't over yet. Christmas Eve itself was colder than the night before, clear, still, and sharp. The stars looked close enough to touch. She lit the lantern earlier than usual, the glass glowing gold against the deepening blue of the evening sky. This time, she didn't wait on the porch. She stood at the edge of the yard, her boots sinking into the crisp snow, breath rising in soft clouds. Her eyes stayed on the tree-line. It didn't take long. The bear emerged slowly, the moonlight catching the curve of his back and the faint scar above his right eye. His paws moved silently despite their size, leaving deep, clean prints behind. And in his mouth, something she hadn't seen before. Not a pinecone. It was a small, weathered bundle, bound with strips of dried grass. He carried it with the same careful hold he always used, setting it gently down in the snow a few feet from her. Aisha crouched, the cold biting through her gloves as she reached for it. The bundle was light, and when she loosened the grass ties, it unfolded to reveal three things. A pinecone, dark, worn, edges chipped. A small, smooth river stone, pale gray with a single dark stripe. And a strip of birch bark, curled and thin, with faint marks scratched across the inside. The scratches weren't random. They curved in a pattern, arches and lines that almost looked deliberate. She traced them lightly with a gloved finger, her mind racing. When she looked up, the bear was still there, watching her. Not from the porch, not from the tree-line, right here, in the open space between them. His breath rose in slow, steady clouds, his eyes reflecting both the lantern glow and the cold moonlight. Something in her shifted. All these years, she had thought of the ritual as his habit, a quirk of nature she had been lucky enough to witness. But now, with the pale stone, the marked bark, and the pinecone together, it felt like something else entirely. A deliberate act. A memory being carried forward, year after year, in a language she couldn't fully speak but somehow understood. She held his gaze for a long time, the cold forgotten. The forest felt quiet around them, as if the snow itself was listening. Finally, he turned and walked away, his great shape fading into the trees. She didn't follow. She stood there in the moonlight, holding the bundle close, knowing the meaning might never be clear but the intent was undeniable. Inside, she placed the bundle in a wooden box on the mantel, separate from the others. The pale pinecone stayed where it was, its presence now even more significant. That night, for the first time, she whispered into the quiet before sleep. "I'll be here next year too." The 10th winter carried with it the weight of a decade. 10 years since the first pinecone. 10 winters of quiet exchanges and silent trust. The mantel above Aisha's stove now told the story in objects, the row of pinecones, the birch bark, the pale stone, the bundle from last year. Each piece was a chapter, and together, they were a language only she and the bear understood. This year, the snow fell thick and soft all day on Christmas Eve, muting the world in a kind of reverent hush. The forest was still, the air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. Aisha dressed warmly, layered against the cold, and lit the lantern early, its glow spilling across the porch and out onto the snow. She didn't pace or fidget. She simply stood on the porch steps, waiting. The first sound she heard wasn't the crunch of snow, it was the low, steady rumble of his breathing as he approached through the trees. The bear emerged slowly, as if unhurried by the years or the cold. The scar above his right eye had faded, softened by time, but his eyes were exactly as she remembered them from the first winter. Steady, watchful, calm. In his mouth, he carried a pinecone. Not unusual. But as he came closer, she saw that it was tied, neatly, with a thin strand of dried grass, around a second object. When he reached the steps, he set it down gently at her feet. The grass ties loosened in the fall of snow, revealing the second object, a small, carved piece of wood. Aisha crouched, lifting it into her hands. The carving was simple but deliberate, a rounded shape, smoothed by touch, with shallow lines that formed the faint outline of a pinecone. It was unlike anything he had brought before. She looked up, and for the first time in all these years, he stepped onto the bottom step. His massive paws pressed into the wood, snow melting in dark patches around them. He was close enough now that she could see the frost clinging to his whiskers, the slow rise and fall of his breath. Neither moved for a long while. The cold stung her cheeks, but she didn't care. She felt the moment settling into her bones, into the part of herself that knew this was more than chance or instinct. Finally, she nodded, small but certain. "I understand." The bear blinked once, the motion slow and deliberate, then stepped back off the porch. He turned toward the forest, his great shape fading into the white, leaving deep tracks behind. Aisha held the carved piece of wood in her hands for a long time before going inside. She placed it in the center of the mantel, in front of all the other objects, and lit a candle beside it. The flicker of the flame danced across the row of gifts, each one carrying the quiet weight of the years. That night, she wrote in her journal, 10 winters, 10 gifts, and one truth, that we are not so different in the way we remember. When she blew out the lantern and the house sank into darkness, she knew that even if the bear never came again, the story was complete. It would live on in the snow, in the pine, in the quiet December nights where the forest holds its breath.